Our scripture reading this morning is taken from the book of Matthew, chapter 23, verses 1 through 12. Then Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, "The scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. Therefore, do whatever they teach you and follow it, but do not as they do, for they do not practice what they teach. They tie up heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on the shoulders of others, but they themselves are unwilling to lift a finger to move them. They do all their deeds to be seen by others, for they make their phylacteries broad and their fringes long. They love to have the place of honor at banquets and the best seats in the synagogues, and to be greeted with respect in the marketplace, and to have people call them rabbi. But you are not to be called rabbi, for you have one teacher, and you are all brothers and sisters. And call no one your father on earth, for you have one Father, the one in heaven. Nor are you to be called instructors, for you have one instructor, the Messiah. The greatest among you will be your servant. All who exalt themselves will be humbled, and all who humble themselves will be exalted." This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks, Kent. And thanks for reading phylacteries. That's always a tough one. Phylacteries. Well, good morning again. In these final weeks of being pastor here at First Presbyterian Church, I was asking and I was praying as to what I should say. And as I shared last week, really kind of at the 11th hour, because I was coming up zeros, God gave me this kind of insight, and I heard or I sensed it's not what should I say, but what has been said. What if voices that are larger than mine and wiser than mine and greater than mine, what have they said these past years that have stuck and have shaped life and ministry? And so in these next weeks, I simply want to pass along these gifts that have been given to me in service and in humility to offer them to you. If for no other reason, some of the stuff that sticks with me may not stick with you, but perhaps the reason would just be that we would all be reminded of these voices that we've all had in our life where God speaks to us through another person. Some of these voices in my life have come from other pastors and mentors. Some of them have come from really unusual places and unexpected places. Some have been completely unexplainable to me and miraculous. But this morning I wanted to share another unexpected voice, a voice that I actually in my life, in my personal life, I turn to frequently, and I find gems of spiritual wisdom that are offered to me in love and in grace, even though this person does not believe as I believe, and they tease me about my beliefs just as much as they offer these words of wisdom and grace. So these are the things that have stuck. And one thing that has definitely stuck, and it sticks to this day, is the best sermon is a good example. The best sermon is a good example. Now, when this person says this to me, note that they're not saying the best sermons have good examples in them. What they're saying is the best sermon, the best message of your life is the way you live your life. What is the example that you're setting? So with our text before us and this idea of the best sermon being the best example, would you pray with me? Holy God, we give you thanks this morning for your word. Even as often happens, Jesus has words for us we may not want to hear. Help us to open our minds and our hearts and our souls and our lives to hear his teaching this morning. that we might, in service and in humility, preach the best sermon by being a good example. In Jesus' name, amen. So I suppose that the best place to start this morning is with this wound. And that's always a really good time when you open up a sermon by talking about wounds. But this wound that has been left by the church on so many people's lives. Jesus says to his followers in our text, he says of the Pharisees, they do not practice what they preach, but they tie up heavy, cumbersome burdens on the shoulders, on the backs of people, and they themselves are not willing to lift a finger to move them. When we read these words, harsh words, I'm not sure we always grapple with the gravitas of what Jesus is saying to us. A little later in this same passage in Matthew 23, Jesus offers his woes to all of these religious folks. Woe are you for this and woe are you for that. These are quite a bit more pointed and hopefully drive home his point. But right here in this text, I think we need to sit with what Jesus is saying. And I mean really sit with this. Sit with this reality that religion can hurt people. Religion can hurt people. It can hurt them so badly and so severely as to distort their entire lives and impact all of their relationships, their understanding of themselves, of God, of faith, of spirituality, of intimacy. And it can have this impact and it stays with them the rest of their lives. Jesus tells us this morning religion can hurt people, and it does hurt people, and it has hurt people. We live in a town, in an area that is littered with people all over who are bleeding out spiritually because of wounds that were dealt to them by the church. That's real. It really happens. It's there, and to some degree, it's even in here. Now, I personally, this is not so that you'll pick up my bad habits that I'm sharing this with you, but I personally, much of the time, I want to take something like this reality, I just want to push it away. Let's put that over there. And the way I do this with issues like this, that I just kind of want to push away, I don't want to deal with, I kind of just want to ignore them, is I have this really clever thing I do. I don't think any of you probably do this, but I go, yeah, but. Anybody else do yeah, but? Yeah, of course religion hurts people, but. And my biggest yeah, but in years past, and I don't know if you'll track with me on this or not, I hope you do, but my biggest yeah, but with this has been this group of people that really have not been hurt by religion or Christianity or the church or Christians, and yet they carry the banner anyways. For as much as I meet people who have genuinely been hurt by the church, I meet just as many or more, or maybe I just like to tip the scales in my favor here. I meet just as many or more who really, when you press them, they've never been hurt by the church or Christians or anything like that. This narrative of the church hurts people, religion hurts people, for them it's just kind of a clever excuse, kind of like my yeah, but. It's just an excuse for them to go on living in their own sort of rebellion. Many of them, you press them just a little bit, they've never been hurt by anyone. They live wonderful lives. They just don't like anyone telling them what to do, and they imagine that religion is there to tell them what to do, and so they don't like that. And so they say, look at all the damage it's done. The longer I go, though, through life, the more my heart aches. The longer I go, the more my heart aches for the real wounds dealt to real people. People I know, people I read or I hear of, who really have been genuinely damaged and hurt by the church. Some of them perhaps irreparably damaged this side of paradise. And I guess some of this is also a sort of developing sensitivity to my own wounds that have been dealt by the church. It's not the kind of work that I really like to do. I don't have fun doing it. Like, let's go on this inner journey where I deal with my own woundedness. But it's important work, right? And some of this is to do with building sensitivities to my own wounds, none of which ever happened here, by the way. Robin got it. But in the pastorate, you have to develop a stiff upper lip. You have to develop a thick skin. You have to be able to buck up and chin up. You have to be able to take a few blows. If you can't and you don't, you just won't make it. All of this that you have to do, I've come to discover is a great disservice to the pastorate. We're becoming a tough pastor or a numbed pastor or even a dissociative pastor at times. It works against the very kinds of sensitivities that you want to foster and cultivate and develop in your ministers and in their ministries. But I guess the biggest development for me as of late, as doing a lot of this inner work, is as these words have stuck with me over the years. The best sermon is a good example. As these words continue to sink into my soul, as all good, wise words tend to do, they sink into your soul over time. What's been happening more in me lately is calling out my own Beau Smith. You think of what the initials stand for. I have to call out my own Beau Smith. I don't know what you guys were thinking. I have to call myself out because the truth is this: I can't do anything about these pretenders who are posing and they're carrying the banner of other people's wounds to support their kind of own laissez-faire, c'est la vie living. I can't do anything about that. The truth is, for all the people that I meet claiming wounds from religion and the church and Christianity, especially that in some cases when you press them, you come to discover they've never experienced anything like that. Maybe they've even experienced the opposite. They've actually experienced the church as a place of love and grace and compassion that accepted them. For as much as it annoys me, and it really does annoy me when people pick up the banner of other people's wounds, for as much as it annoys me, it does not diminish the real wounds. And it doesn't heal the really wounded. And so it doesn't at all get me or any of us off the hook of the damages actually done. It doesn't in any way, shape, or form allow me to sidestep Jesus' very harsh teaching here. It doesn't, my yeah, but doesn't work. In fact, there's another word of advice for you in there. The yeah buts never actually work. So here, the best sermon is a good example. I cannot minimize those heavy burdens laid on other people's shoulders that the church has saddled them with. Heavy burdens like abuse, or like grace mixed with works to the point where you're just working off your sin for the rest of your life. Or like the way that we can look down on others for any reason whatsoever, their race, their gender, their sexuality, their economic status, their mental health, their mental capabilities. Or the way that we'll look down on people because those are those kind of purified, holier-than-thou Christians over there, and we're the cool Christians over here. Or we look down on them for their politics, or their education, or their lack of education. We'll come up with millions of reasons to look down on another person. Heavy burdens like false teachings that pull the rug out from under others of God's grace, but it's still free to us. Heavy burdens like insisting on doing church our way and keeping people on track with our traditions and our way of doing things, sometimes at the expense of sacrificing Christ himself on the altar of, we've always done it that way before. I hear the best sermon is a good example. Now, the person that shares this with me, says this to me, has been saying this to me for years, and they carry some wounds, not church wounds necessarily, or not a lot of church wounds, but life wounds, big time. So these words, again, these things that have stuck with me, these are not empty words. This is not hollow advice. This too, like last week, my son's neurologist, just enjoy him. This too comes from a deep well of knowledge and experience. This comes from the well of the wound. Oh, the best sermon is a good example. And here's the real difficulty of Jesus' teaching this morning. It's all difficult, but here's one of the difficulties. He says, do as they say, but not as they do. Sometimes the sermon's good no matter how bad a person the preacher is. And personally, do as they say, but not as they do. I really don't like that. I really do not like the idea of listening to someone who says one thing, even if what they're saying is good and true and it's good, but lives another thing. It's more than annoying to me, like those people that are carrying the banner of somebody else's wounds. It makes me feel sick. And I suppose that's yet another wound of the church, right? That many people know that what we say here is true and good and beautiful, and they would even do it if we would but lead by example. Do as they say and not as they do. That is a very tough teaching. For me, this is almost at the level of love your enemies. This might even be harder for me than to love my enemies. I think I'd actually rather love my enemies than associate with or be associated with or have guilt by association with hypocrites. I do not like that. And it feels to me like this teaching today, it's more relevant than ever. And yet, at least I can say of the text, Jesus was wise and Jesus was very honest. He basically is telling us, if you want to follow me, there are going to be hypocrites involved. There will be people following me who talk a really good game and they live a really terrible life. That's a part of the reality of it. There will be people who say they are following me, who talk in niceties and are very polite, but then they're just awful to other people behind the scenes. He even says it this way one time. He says, "There's going to be wolves in sheep's clothing." And yet still, he says, do as they say. You can do as they say, just don't do as they do. And I think, yeah, but Jesus, the best sermon is a good example. There's a couple of things that kind of help me intellectually here. They kind of help me work it through in the mind. And the first being, as I mentioned before, that Jesus is at least transparent. Jesus never pulls any punches. He's always very realistic about how human beings work. These words that are not just about the Pharisees. Of course they're not about the Pharisees. This is like some of the best predictive future speech Jesus ever did. These words are about the church. They're about us. And I guess this helps me because at least I know I'm following someone who will tell me what I'm in for. I can follow someone who will tell me what I'm in for. Hey, we're going for the good, but there's going to be some ugly. I can do that. The other thing that helps me intellectually here is Jesus' deference to Moses. He says these hypocrites, they're mouthpieces for something that it's actually beyond them and it's bigger than them. And it's something they clearly don't understand. It's something they clearly don't actually follow, but they can at least repeat it. They're sitting in that seat of Moses. They can at least repeat it. And so sure, they're parroting things, but they're parroting good things. Sure, they're just kind of giving lip service to this, but what they're uttering is still truth. In other words, Jesus is telling his disciples that day, don't throw away Moses for all the bad teachers in Israel. And I think that Jesus would say the same to us today. Don't throw away Jesus for all the people doing a bad job following him. It's good to know the difference between Christ and a Christian. And that helps me. At least it intellectually helps me. It helps me kind of do that sort of intellectual jumping over the hump. But it still doesn't get to that gut, visceral, inner response, that agonizing response I have over hypocrisy. It doesn't absolve the church, the church body. It doesn't absolve us that together, even if we do it peripherally or inadvertently or unknowingly, we participate in this thing that has hurt people. It doesn't heal wounds to just be able to think about it and go, okay, well, I can buy Moses even though I don't buy this guy. I can buy into Jesus even though I don't buy into bad followers. And I can even share this, like, kind of don't throw the baby out with the bathwater wisdom with other wounded people. And I notice that sometimes they can even accept that. But what I don't see it doing is doing much in the way of actually healing or inviting them into the life of Christ or inviting them into the life of a church that has wounded them. The best sermon is a good example. Then I have my other yeah, but. Yeah, but the problem with the best sermon being a good example is what that means and what that looks like can be incredibly complex. In our world, being a good example, that's not easy to figure out. And then you run into this problem in our world where it doesn't seem like anybody cares. Nobody cares about your example. So it feels fruitless to live as a good example because we live in a culture that's so incredibly narcissistic. They're all just looking at themselves. Nobody's looking at you. Nobody's watching you. You can say one thing and do something completely different and hardly a person will notice, right? except in our case, they do. In our case, for whatever reason, they are watching. They are watching us in particular. They are watching many times and just waiting for their own confirmation bias. See? Told you those Christians. But the eyes of the world, even as the world might reject everything that's good and wonderful and worth keeping, they seem to mysteriously, I couldn't even explain it to you, they seem to mysteriously always stay fixed on the church. You see, the world is watching you. They actually are watching us. And the reason I know this is because the world is so quick to jump on one bad thing, one misstep, one mistake that we make, and yet they are so very slow to recognize all of the good that has been done by Christianity. The world is a better place because of Christianity. But the truth is, for whatever reason, as much as they're not watching anything else, they are watching you. Yeah, but being a good example, that's so complex. How can you even do that? And here I think Jesus gives us a key. He gives us kind of like, here's the cheat code for living as a good example. And it's something that actually doesn't just work for the mind, but it also works for healing the heart and healing the soul. And he says it at the end of our passage. He says, "The greatest among you will be a servant. For those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted." The best sermon is a good example. And as hard as it can be, I think, and it is hard, to suss out what is that going to look like in all places, in all times, in every situation. How am I going to be a good example everywhere I go? Here, I think Jesus, he actually gives us a loophole for being a good example in every place, every situation, and in every time. And the loophole is service and humility. If you want to lead by example, as the world is watching you, and they are, become a servant in this world. In every situation you find yourself in, just imagine Jesus asking, not what would he do? That's a very complex question. What would Jesus do? I have no idea. Ask this question instead. How can I serve here? I come to church, how can I serve here? I go to work, how can I serve there? I'm with my spouse, my loved ones, how can I serve here? How can I serve God and neighbor? I think this gives you a really strong chance of getting it right, being a good example most of the time. I think it's probably your best, simplest shot. How can I be of service here? If you want to experience grace from God, which is a given, but grace from this world even, for all the times that we miss the mark, all the times that we mess up, I think humility goes a long, long ways. If you want to let go of your own inner hypocrisy, which we all deal with. In fact, I think that's why I struggle with it so much in the world, is because I really hate it when I see it in myself. If you want to deal with your own little inner hypocrite, your own little Beau Smith, whatever you want to think that is. Robin got it again. If you want to deal with that inner space, service and humility is really a surefire way to work on this. If we want for people to hear what we have to say, to listen to our sermons, even our life sermons, my sermons, serving in humility will likely get you there. If you want to be a part of Jesus' desire to heal those who have been wounded, especially those who have been wounded by the church, by people saying they're trying to follow him, I think service and humility is an absolute must. The best sermon is a good example. And a good example, I think, starts with service and humility. And this is just another one of those things that I want to share in these last weeks, one of those things that has really stuck. And it sticks with me still. So I offer it to you now in service and in humility. The best sermon is a good example. And all God's people said.